Good afternoon. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and it has occurred to our speaker and me and maybe some of you that today is the second anniversary of Zero Dark 30. It was on May 2nd at 12:30 a.m. that the takedown of Osama bin Laden occurred, and somebody to my left had a lot to do with that. More later. A special welcome to the chairman of our board, Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn, and his wife, a member of our council, Alma Gildenhorn, and our panelists, Admiral Bill McRaven, Dan Feldman, and Linda Robinson, and Wilson Center Air Force fellow Wolf Davidson, who is where? There. You can sit down. Come on. Who is working on a project on the growing relevance of the high-end capabilities of special ops and is educating our board, scholars, and staff. Thank you, Wolf, for all that you do for us here. It's also a pleasure to see Sue Eikenberry and her public policy class from Georgetown Day School. Where are they? There they are. For several reasons. 20-something years ago, Sue taught my oldest son, Brian, coached him in debate, and wrote his college recommendation. He got in. Just want you to know, Sue, that though he now handles a large investment fund in New York, Brian still loves public policy and was a close advisor to his mom during my 17 years in Congress. You did a really good job. Today's event is part of a series the Wilson Center sponsors with NPR called The National Conversation. Our hope is that these forums will give the public new opportunities to engage in much-needed civil discourse free from spin. I'll repeat that in this town. Free from spin in the safe political space that the Wilson Center provides. We have tried to raise difficult questions about our post-9/11 world. On the 10th anniversary of 9/11, for instance, we asked the question, 9/11, the next 10 years, to a group that included General Stan McChrystal, one of Bill McRaven's predecessors, Mike Rogers, who is chairman of the House Intelligence Committee and a former colleague of mine, and Mike Leiter, former director of the National Counterterrorism Center. On another occasion, John Brennan, when he was President Obama's chief counterterrorism advisor, spoke here about the need for rules around our use of drones, an issue that is not yet fully resolved. And General Keith Alexander, the head of Cyber Command and the National Security Agency, came here to discuss how to get the public into the debate about cyber, another tough issue. As the towers were falling and the Pentagon fire was burning on 9/11, I was a senior member of the House Intelligence Committee and headed to the Capitol Dome. That is where the Intelligence Committee rooms were then located, and it was the intended target, most believe, of the fourth airplane that went down in Pennsylvania. Looking back on my own role, I give myself mixed marks, but am most proud of my role as the principal author of the 2004 Intelligence Reform Law. In my travels to all of the garden spots like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, I saw the courage and selflessness of our military and intelligence personnel. I saw up close the extraordinary things that special ops teams are capable of, and I believe that they are heroes. But as seductive and effective as these tactics are, there is a question about whether we have a strategy, a narrative that explains our actions properly and convincingly to the rest of the world. Stan McChrystal, whom I first met in Iraq, was interviewed recently in Foreign Affairs magazine. In Iraq, he said, his first question was, where is the enemy? As things evolved, his question became, who is the enemy? And then, what's the enemy doing or trying to do? And finally, why are they the enemy? I'm stuck on this last question, and I'm sure it will receive focus in today's discussion. The format is that Bill McRaven will deliver keynote remarks, followed by a panel moderated by NPR's Tom Bowman, who is sitting right there in the check shirt, looking quite dashing. As NPR's Pentagon reporter, Tom has traveled to Iraq and Afghanistan for month-long visits and embedded with U.S. Marines and soldiers. He previously spent 9 years as a Pentagon reporter at the Baltimore Sun. And it's now my special pleasure to introduce my friend, Bill McRaven, a U.S. Navy admiral who has served as the commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command, U.S. SOCOM, since August 2011, and previously served as commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, and Special Operations Command Europe, SOCUR. I got all the acronyms right. The mastermind, or a mastermind, with an excellent team of the bin Laden raid, Admiral McRaven briefed President Obama during the operation in real time through a secure video from Jalalabad, Afghanistan. He was portrayed in the movie Zero Dark 30, which he has never seen. He's going to tell you this, but which I have seen 4 times, by the actor Christopher Stanley. All Mad Men and Argo fans in the room should know who that is. There's an uncanny resemblance. He doesn't speak publicly that often, which is probably appropriate given his role, but I was there when he was interviewed by Wolf Blitzer last summer in Aspen, and when he spoke at the Newsweek Daily Beast Summit on Heroes, appropriately named, last November. We are fortunate that he's making an appearance here and addressing Special Ops, the long game. Please join me in welcoming him now.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Jane. And I'd like to thank the Wilson Center and NPR for giving me an opportunity to talk about special operations today. Now, I don't really have any prepared remarks, and I would hesitate to call this a keynote address. But what I did want to do is talk a little bit about special operations, give you a sense of who we are, kind of where we're going, and some of the challenges that I think we're going to face. So let me start off with who we are. First, this is a force of about 66,000 folks, of which half of that force are what we would call badged operators. So SEALs, Rangers, Special Operations aviators, Green Berets, and the rest are kind of support personnel that are absolutely essential to our mission. Special Operations forces have been around for a long time. As long as there has been a U.S. military, there have been aspects of Special Operations forces. But the U.S. Special Operations Command came into existence in 1987 as a result of the failed raid to rescue our hostages out of Tehran. And the Congress actually enacted law to bring U.S. Special Operations Command into play. We are very unique, the U.S. Special Operations Command. We have service-like responsibilities, so I have the requirement to man, train, and equip a force. But I also have what we call combatant commander responsibilities, meaning that I have a responsibility to build strategies and to employ those forces with the support and with the approval of the geographic combatant commanders. These are very unique qualities for a command. So I have an acquisition executive. At lunch today, one of the gentlemen was asking me how I deal with having to get all my money from the services. The fact of the matter is, Congress was smart when they stood us up, and they gave us a budget. And that budget has been very helpful to making sure that our forces have the best equipment out there. So with this force of about 66,000, recognizing that about half of those are tactical folks, we deploy about 11,000 folks around the world at any point in time, and in about 78 countries around the world. But now let's talk about the average SOF operator, because I think there's this belief that that SOF operators are all very young, steely-eyed killers, you know, that have no respect for pick something. The reality of the matter is, the average officer out there is about 34 years old. The average enlisted man is about 28. They are married with 2 kids on average. And that's important. That's important because you have a sense of your responsibility by the time you're 28. You have some life experience by the time you're 28. And if you have kids, then you know how to run an organization. And you know how to deal with tough problems. So that is not a small point when you compare us to some of the other forces. Also, what we found, we took a survey of about 900 special operations folks. And not surprisingly, just about all of them played some sort of sport. What was surprising was the intersection of a sport and the game of chess. The preponderance of the folks that we interviewed played chess. And of course, this is exactly the kind of guy or gal we're looking for. Somebody who is the athlete and the thinker. And that has kind of been consistent as we have built our SOF community. One of the other things that people think about when they think of special operations, and as Jane said, Zero Dark 30, or they have read books, or they've seen some other movie. But the reality of the matter is the counterterrorism piece, the direct action piece of what we do, is a very small part of our portfolio. And in fact, what I think is the more important part of what we do is building partner capacity, is our day-to-day interaction with our allies and partners around the globe. And so that kind of leads me into where we're going. So I talked about the fact that the law back in 1987 enacted U.S. SOCOM, and it told me as a Special Operation Commander and all my predecessors to build a strategy and to put that strategy in place. But you have to have a foundation from which to develop that strategy. And that foundation for us was the Secretary of Defense's Defense Strategic Guidance. This was signed out by former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta in January of 2012. So that became the foundation for which I'm trying to develop the Special Operations vision. And in that strategy, the Secretary said, in addition to the pivot to Asia, he talked about the fact that we're going to need forces that are light, that are agile, that are responsive, that are networked, that are partnered. These sorts of things, of course, are core competencies of our U.S. Special Operations Command. So in that light, what I am trying to do is enhance, and the word is enhance, the global soft network. We have had special operations operators out around the globe for decades. But now we have the ability through communications technology to be able to kind of knit this capability together. So I'm going to walk you through kind of piece by piece how this enhancement is going to work. So within the military construct, the way we command and control forces is through the geographic combatant commanders. So I think all of you know we'll take Central Command as a point of departure. So Central Command, currently commanded by General Lloyd Austin, one of the great officers in the United States Army and the United States military. So he has responsibility for Iraq, Afghanistan, and those areas within the Central Command. And every commander has a geographic responsibility. So you have Central Command, you have Pacific Command, European Command, Southern Command, Africa Command, Northern Command, etc. Each of those geographic combatant commanders have theater special operations commands. So each one of them have a subordinate command that is responsible for the special operations piece. And that's very important to me. Now, historically, the U.S. Special Operations Command has had no relationship, no institutional relationship with those theater special operations commands. So while they were soft folks, at the end of the day, we really didn't provide them much money. We didn't provide them really any guidance. We didn't really equip them. At the end of the day, they were kind of on their own to be able to support the geographic combatant commander. Now, my predecessor twice removed, Doug Brown, General Doug Brown, began to put a little bit of effort and a little bit of money into the theater special operations commands. As Jane said, when I was the SOC-EUR commander, the commander of the Special Operations Forces in Europe, I was a beneficiary of that money. It was great to have some support coming to the SOC. The guy right before me, Admiral Eric Olson, kind of ramped that up. So this really becomes kind of a natural extension, which is now, as of several months ago, Secretary Panetta, and before he departed, signed out a document that put those theater special operations commands under my combatant command, still reporting to the geographic combatant commander. Now, the reason I'm kind of giving you Military 101 is because this framework is very important to understand. Because, as I've said, I don't command and control anything from U.S. Special Operations Command. My mission is to provide the right talent, the right capability to those theater special operations commands so that they, in fact, can support the geographic combatant commanders. Now, as the U.S. Special Operations Command, I have a functional responsibility, which is global. So now by having those TSOCs, as we call them, to plug into, I can take a look at what's happening in Central Command and see the relationships between Central Command and Africa Command and Southern Command and Pacific Command and the relationship to Northern Command. I can begin to put these pieces together because now I have an institutional relationship with those theater special operations commands. So each one of those TSOCs, as I said, work for the geographic combatant commander. They also have subordinate commands. So in your mind, as you're thinking through this, you have to think about a network, and you can think of it as any sort of network you've ever worked with. You have nodes, and from those nodes you have branches. So the GCC, the Geographic Combatant Commander, has the TSOC. The TSOC has some subordinate commands. The TSOC also has Special Operations Liaison Officers. Case in point, Special Operations Command Europe has a Special Forces, an Army Green Beret colonel, who is in Turkey. He is married to a Turkish woman. He speaks the language fluently, and his ability to get our message across to the Turks and vice versa for the Turks to be able to engage with us to build that trust factor is absolutely crucial. We were talking at lunch about the value of trust. And as I said, what I am trying to do as part of this vision is to change the narrative about who we are as Special Operations Forces. Everybody has seen the movie, and that's important, but at the end of the day, it's about building partner capacity so that nations can deal with their own problems, so that we can help them deal with their own problems. But you can't get there unless you can begin to build the trust factor. So as we put people out in these various countries, and I talked about us being in 78 countries around the world, we have people that speak the language, that are culturally attuned. It is a very small footprint, so you don't have a large force that is imposing itself upon the country. We work hand in hand with the U.S. mission, the embassy there. And I will state this for the record as many times as I can. We do not do anything, nothing, that doesn't have the approval of the chief of mission, of the ambassador that's there. We don't do anything that doesn't have the approval of the geographic combatant commander. So these are two important concepts. So as we go forward to build partner capacity, to build the trust, to build the network, it is all done in concert with the country team and the embassy. So you begin to see how the network builds. Theater Special Operations Commands, they have subordinate commands. There are liaison officers that come out from that are in various places. We also have a great relationship with our partners, and I'd like to give you one vignette. The NATO SOF headquarters, so NATO Special Operations Headquarters, which was established as the NATO SOF Coordination Center back in late 2006. And we really began to build this capability in early 2007. And at the time, there were 18 people in the NATO SOF Coordination Center. There were 17 Americans and 1 Norwegian. And frankly, obviously not very effective. There were 300 SOF operators downrange in Afghanistan at the time. So this was early 2007. Today there are 220 folks in a NATO SOF headquarters. There are 2,200 NATO SOF operators downrange conducting arguably one of the most important missions in Afghanistan, and that's building the provincial response companies. So it was a way of linking into our allies. We had a common standard for planning, for training, for operations. Those allies then, of their own accord, their own volition, and in support of us, went forward to Afghanistan and did a mission that then we didn't have to do. So part of tapping into our allies is to understand what their capabilities are, helping to build their capabilities. That again, as former Secretary Clinton once said, it's about kind of smart power. And the ability to have smart power downrange is to be able to leverage the great work of your allies and partners. And speaking of partners, so as you begin to look at this, again, the TSOCs, the LNOs, the allies, and our partners for us are the interagency. So as the U.S. Special Operations Command, I have folks in every agency here in Washington, D.C., from the CIA to the FBI to the National Security Agency to the National Geospatial Agency to the Defense Intelligence Agency. If there are 3 letters, and in some cases 4, I have a person there. And they have had a reciprocal agreement with us. I have somebody in my headquarters at Tampa. And again, why is that important? It's because you have to be able to translate sometimes the language of a particular culture within the agency. And you've got to be able to have those liaisons be representative of you and of the head of those organizations. So when I have an issue, I'm able to reach into my liaison officer at State Department or at CIA or at DIA or at NGA, and they can help, work out problems that might have occurred as a result of something we're trying to do around the world. That is incredibly important to us. That liaison network, as all of us that have spent time in the military knows, is vital to your success. But we also have liaison officers with industry and with academia. Colonel Wolf Davidson was mentioned here earlier. He's here at the Wilson Center. We put some of our best and brightest at some of the academic institutions so we can understand what academia is thinking about. We recognize right up front that not all the great ideas about the military come from inside the military. We're trying to reach out to see what young minds and older minds think about what we're doing and how we can take that advice and incorporate it back into our business. To put all this together, we have a very robust communications architecture. So many years ago, we recognized that for us to be able to do business, we had to be able to video teleconference. Now that sounds pretty routine today, but I can tell you and Jane was referring to Stan McChrystal, I'll tell you, when Stan McChrystal came to the Joint Special Operations Command, we would conduct video teleconferences, and maybe 50% of them worked. And frankly, most people didn't want to do video teleconferences. They just kind of wanted to get on email and not be bothered by having to do face-to-face discussions. And Stan very quickly said, look, you are either going to be a zealot or you're going to be a martyr, but we are going to do video teleconferences. And so we began to build the infrastructure, and of course it cost a fair amount to build that communications infrastructure, but what it allowed us to do at the Joint Special Operations Command was then, from General McChrystal down to the youngest operator, he could pass commander's intent, and he could hear what that young operator was thinking and was doing, and oh, by the way, then we passed it across the entire network. So understanding how that network functioned, to be able to have communications across the length and breadth of the network, to have business rules in place so that everybody understood what their rules and responsibilities were, that was crucial. And frankly, that's how that organization that Stan McChrystal built was so effective. So now what we're trying to do is kind of enhance the Special Operations Network by doing the same thing. How do I push communications down to every liaison officer I have at a U.S. embassy, every liaison officer or every operator I have down in the field? And we are doing that. So let me talk now about our challenges. Probably the biggest challenge I have are supporting our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and their families. So these servicemen and women have been in this fight for 12 years. And really, in my organization, everybody who wears a Special Forces badge or a SEAL badge, some sort of operator, has been in hard combat sometime in the last 12 years. Most of those young men and women multiple times downrange. And that has taken a toll on them. It has taken a toll on their families. And I came in right after the Vietnam War. And candidly, we as a nation didn't do a great job of taking care of our Vietnam vets and their family. We are not going to make that mistake this time around. So I am absolutely committed to making sure we are taking care of the mind, the body, and the spirit of our soldiers and their families. My predecessor, Admiral Eric Olson, put together what he called the POTF, which was the Pressure on the Force Task Force. And he sent chaplains and a number of subject matter experts out for 10 months. And they interviewed about 7,000 service members, 1,000 wives. They had 440 different meetings. And 10 months later, they came back, and that report landed on my desk about the day I took command. And I think Eric had appropriately characterized the force at the time, and he said, the force is frayed. And we weren't falling apart at the seams, but we were frayed. Well, I can tell you in the last 20 months since I've had command, the fraying has accelerated. And so we are working hard to get ahead of that. And some of this is building up physical fitness capabilities so that the guys, before they go overseas, while they're overseas, and when they come back, are physically prepared to do the job for them and for their families. And again, it is the full range of support to the members and their families. The second challenge, as you might imagine, would be the fiscal environment we're in. I can tell you that nobody in my organization believes that as we go forward, that the U.S. Special Operations Command will not also have to participate and potentially be taxed as a result of the sequestration and the needs to move forward on the budget. We are working with the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Staff to articulate what we give them, what their return on the investment is, and I think we can make a good argument. But make no mistake about it, the budget will affect us either directly or as it affects the services, it will affect us. So we don't do anything that doesn't have a service component to it. And this is, again, something that's frequently misunderstood. And one of our principles within Special Operations is that we don't do anything without the service support. So I will have an Air Force ISR platform flying, or it will be an Air Force C-17 that will move us from point A to point B, or it will be a Navy submarine off the coast that is helping launch the SEALs, or it will be an Army brigade that's providing route clearance packages. We don't do anything that we don't get support from the services and, frankly, the interagency. So as those cuts come to the services, that will either directly or indirectly affect U.S. Special Operations Command. And finally, let me just address what I think are some misperceptions out there about what makes Special Operations Forces good. Again, you tend to read the books and you see the movies, and I think there's a belief out there sometimes that we as SOF operators are kind of cavalier in the way we approach things, that there is a certain swagger to a SOF operator, and that swagger extends into how we do business. I will tell you, that is about as far from the truth as it comes. We follow rules. And the reason we follow rules is because most of those rules have been written in blood. So what you learn is if you want to be good, you better be disciplined. You better follow the rules. You better be trustworthy, because the first time you violate that trust with one of your counterparts, whether it's an allied, whether it's a partner, whether it's a general purpose force, the first time you violate that trust will be the last time they'll work with you. Trust is vitally important to us. We are competent and we are held to a high standard. Now, we make mistakes. It's like anybody else, we are human, but we are establishing as high a standard as possible for our SOF operators. So anybody that thinks that you can be cavalier and unprofessional and get this job done is just patently wrong. It is all about our ability to follow rules, to be professional, to hold our operators to a high standard, and to support the policy of the United States. So with that, I will stop, Jane, and turn it back over to you in the forum. Thank you.
Okay, now do I do introductions of our friends here as well? Okay, everyone, or you guys need no introduction?
Forget Grandma and forget Admiral McRaven.
Right. Then we will introduce Linda Robinson, an old friend. Linda Robinson is a senior policy analyst at RAND, and she was also a senior adjunct fellow, Council on Foreign Relations, also a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. And the Council on Foreign Relations just published her special report, The Future of Special Operations Forces, which is something we can hear today. And her book on Special Operations Forces, 100 Victories, Special Operations Forces, and the Future of American Warfare, will be published in the fall. She has written numerous books, and like me, a former ink-stained wretch in the print press. And we also have Dan Feldman. He's one of 2 deputies to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He previously served as a partner in the law firm of Foley Hogue. His previous government experience includes serving on the National Security Council with the Clinton administration. He also served on the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. So, now we start the panel discussion. I can't tell you how happy I am that I don't have to raise my hand and have someone call on me, that I can actually start out here. Okay. So, Admiral McRaven, word is that you want to create an empire. That you want to do more with training, with intelligence gathering, with liaison work. That you want to get around the normal Pentagon deployment cycles, which has led to complaints from Congress, from your fellow military services, and also from the State Department.
You're going to start off with an easy one, aren't you?
An easy one. And also, this is more for the entire panel as well, but I'm just wondering, in all of what you're trying to do, and in all of this, what we heard today, are we over-militarizing foreign policy? I was up at the Army War College, and that was one of the issues that came up. It was a forum much like we have here. Or do you think the military, and especially the aggressive and talented Special Operations Command, is able to do this? Because the State Department too often sits inside the embassy and doesn't get out in the field to deal with locals.
Well, let me take your first point last, because actually that's not the case. The State Department is out and about all over the place. And you know, when Jane talked about the Hero Summit that we had not too long ago, and one of the points I raised, I said, let me tell you about who my heroes are. You know, the Ryan Crockers of this world, the Ann Pattersons, the Jerry Firesteins, the Jim Jeffries, guys and gals that have spent their life serving this nation as ambassadors, and every day, and I don't think people fully appreciate this. So when you're the ambassador in Pakistan or Iraq or Afghanistan, as soon as you step foot outside that embassy, frankly, your life is a little bit at risk. So as you're moving from point A to point B in a helicopter, or whether you're in a convoy, or whether you're getting and outreaching to the people, you are at risk. And these great Americans have been doing this their whole career. So any belief that the State Department is sheltered inside their embassy is just not the case at all. Certainly not with my experience. I have been blessed to work with some magnificent State Department folks, from the ambassadors down to the foot soldiers on the ground, if you will. Now, as far as militarizing foreign policy, again, I would take some umbrage with that, in that, I mean, what we do is we support foreign policy. Unfortunately, what happens is sometimes we're about the only tool that's available, and so if it's the only tool you have in your tool chest, you reach for it, you're going to get a certain result. But at the end of the day, as I said earlier in my comments, we do what the U.S. ambassador and what the policymakers want us to do. And I'm happy with that. In terms of building an empire, as I said at lunch, part of what I'm trying to do is provide capability forward. So somebody once asked, why are you doing this? What is the value to U.S. Special Operations Command? Well, the value to the U.S. Special Operations Command is that I am putting the world's finest special operations forces out with the geographic combatant commanders. And if they perform well, and there is a demand signal, then frankly the requirement for special operations forces, I think, is better understood. It is easier to defend my budget, in all honesty, and they do great work for the American people. So if that's empire building, then I'm guilty as charged. So
what is it that members of Congress, military services, and the State Department don't understand?
Well, the military services, I don't think, have a problem with this, and we've. When we started this, enhancing the Global Soft Network, 20 months ago, there were some probably misunderstandings with some of the geographic combatant commanders. Once they understood that it was absolutely not my intent to kind of move their forces around, and they talked to other combatant commanders who had the advantage of having special operations forces in their areas, like General Jim Mattis, who was at CENTCOM at the time, General Carter Ham was at AFRICOM. They very quickly said, hey, this is a great deal and you ought to, support it. They did, and frankly, we kind of quickly got over that. So the services, I don't think, have a problem at all. And as I said, we're very, very dependent on the services.
In State Department and Congress, what do they understand?
Well, the State Department, this is part of what I've got to do, is to be able to articulate appropriately to my state counterparts what we are attempting to provide them, and to get over some of the misperceptions. And there are some misperceptions, and there are some, again, I think, some mischaracterizations of who we are. And the point I always raise is we don't do anything, nothing, that doesn't have the approval of the Chief of Mission. So, some people their opinions are formed by movies and books, and they believe that that's the way we operate. And in fact, as I said, it's just the opposite. For me to do anything requires us to go up through the Joint Staff to get the approvals of the Joint Staff, or OSD. We move down range, the country team and the Chief of Mission have to approve that as well. So there's a very well delineated process that puts us in a position to help the embassies.
In Congresswoman Harman, what about your fellow colleagues, your former colleagues on the Hill? Did they misperceive this, or there was some reports that they thought that Admiral McRaven was moving too fast to get around deployment orders, normal deployment orders at the Pentagon? What happened up there, do you think?
Well, I don't serve there anymore, and I'm not exactly sure who may have complained, but I'm guessing that the complaints echo something they've heard from the Pentagon. And turf protection is a great motivator in the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill, so it may have more to do with that
than what is actually,
yes, the Rice Bowl syndrome. And the we even have that at the Wilson Center, and we're trying to break down the silos and have us have a horizontal structure, which, by the way, is what Goldwater Nichols did.
Absolutely.
That's what Admiral McRaven is referring to in the 80s, that created his command and combined and leveraged all the services, and that's what intelligence reform in 2004 was intended to do too, the new law, which I had some role in. And none of this works perfectly, but it's working better. In response to your question though, Tom, I mean, at least as I see it, and I'm the one who raised Stan McChrystal's questions, why is he the enemy? I think we need to do a much better job of explaining what we do, not just domestically, although I think that matters, but internationally. And the goal is to persuade that kid in the boonies of Yemen not to strap on a suicide vest. He has to see some better options. And we have to project our values better, especially the rule of law. And this putting drone policy under strict law is still a work in progress. There is this issue of closing Gitmo, which I strongly favor, and that will take some work with the Congress. But I think special operations has a major role to play, the use of kinetics, in a strategy that also includes, and I'm sure we're going to hear this from the other panelists, a surge in diplomacy and development. Those are part of our power that can maybe win more hearts and minds than Bill McRaven's teams in the middle of the night.
But that's what I was getting to, that there's a sense of over-militarization of foreign policy, that you folks in the military have more people in military bands than the entire Foreign Service, and that USAID has become a contracting agency over the past number of years. USIA, I don't think many people in this room, particularly younger people, wouldn't even know what it is. That's long gone. Talk a little bit about that, Dan.
Sure. I think rather than focus on any potential differences there may be, I think the real story here is the really unprecedented manner in which development experts and diplomats have worked alongside, side by side, the military, and in support of a common vision and in support of our policies. And working collectively as civilian military partners, we help to ensure that we bring to bear all the instruments of U.S. power, and that we do so in a very coordinated manner. And to your initial question about what we've managed to do in a place like Afghanistan, that has meant in the last few years quadrupling the number of civilians that we had in the field, from just over 300 to around 1,200. We're starting to come down from that at this point, but that was across the government, a real, true whole-of-government effort, where it was 9 or 10 different agencies. You quadrupled the number of agriculture experts, rule of law experts, a whole range of others. But they were also doing it not just from the safety of the embassy, but increasingly in the field. And at its height, we had diplomats and development professionals operating at 80 forward platforms throughout Afghanistan. And indeed, I came here directly from the memorial service for Ann Smedinghoff, who was recently killed very tragically. But we are very much out in the fray, and I think in the course of doing so have had truly impactful results, again, in partnership with the military on the educational front, on the life expectancy, on the capacity of the Afghan government, on rule of law issues, on any number of issues. We work together to make sure that we But
I got to tell you, along those lines, my time in Afghanistan, I sat down a couple of years ago with a Marine colonel in Helmand province, and he told me, hey, Tom, if there's been a civilian surge in this country, I haven't seen it. There weren't enough State Department people in the field helping him. And there were some really intrepid folks like Carter Malkasian and Cale Weston out there, but they were saying there just weren't enough. And if you read Rajiv's book, Little America, he talks about the bungles of USAID in Afghanistan, the waste of money.
I think that's an outdated story. I mean, I think look, diplomats and development workers operate on different timelines than our military partners. Our standard operating procedures are different. The tools that we have to deploy are different. But at the end of the day, we were there in complete partnership. I think you'll hear that increasingly from people that you speak with throughout the country, and with real results. And you're operating in a conflict, a significant conflict territory. And so are you going to have continuing recurring issues on capacity, on corruption, on any range of things that mean that not every dollar is as well spent as one would want it? Absolutely. And we have, we're before Congress on a weekly basis talking about our oversight mechanisms and everything else, that we try to make sure that it's utilized as best as possible. But that doesn't mean that we're not out there without and having accomplished some real goals.
And let's bring in Linda Robinson now. Do you want to address some of these issues? Particularly, do we have an emperor sitting next to us here, or do we have an admiral?
If I might just first make 2 quick points on this broader topic, because I think it's very important that Congress support the budgets for state and aid so that you have capable partners out there on the ground. And I spent much of the last 2 years out in Afghanistan following this special operations initiative called Village Stability Operations. And I witnessed some very valiant young civilians, and some not so young, but out there on the ground level. Office of Transition Initiatives, I would point out, particularly from U.S. aid. Those are very expeditionary-minded, fearless people. But the embassy regional security officer often restricts their movements. And that, I know, is a force protection issue meant for their safety, but it can really impede this one team on the ground. So I do think there are issues, and plus there are stovepipes still between state aid and the military that I think people have to address. As far as the issue about whether special operations forces writ large, I'd like to just step back for a minute and say I think the big change coming is a shift away from the emphasis on counterterrorism of the last decade, meaning strike, unilateral raiding operations, to building partner capacity. As the Admiral says, the question is getting better at it. And I think that was the focus of the report that I wrote for the Council, and I think that is certainly what the Admiral is looking at doing. And I would just highlight that there are some very important personnel development initiatives, because it's all about having sophisticated soft leaders who can knit together those interagency teams and craft those strategies.
And walk us through, yes, bullet points about how you would create a better soft.
Right. Well, the key recommendation, I don't believe it is on the menu for SOCOM. I want to emphasize this is an independent report. But a number of the interview subjects stressed that because SOCOM does not have control of its personnel, they belong to the services, that it would be beneficial for Congress to consider changing the legislation and granting co-management of personnel so that those individuals can be developed throughout their career in partnership with what the soft leadership thinks they need to do. So that's really the key recommendation there. And I think the other, we'll talk more about TSOCs probably as we get into this, but the other issue I'd like to raise is there's been tremendous growth at SOCOM, but the policy shop at the Pentagon has remained the same in terms of size, and it also has often been given responsibilities that have nothing to do with special operations. And I think that because everyone recognizes special operations are a much bigger part of all national security issues today, virtually all, that needs to be looked at as well.
And speaking of the policy shop, I've talked to people who say that staff has grown enormously over the years and maybe be too bloated as we speak now. Mm-hmm. But
many for counter-narcotic, for other activities that don't necessarily optimize the soft forces, especially since they have to not only pivot to a new focus, but they also have to get much better at it. And I think getting better at it includes addressing these concerns and the trust deficit issue that people don't understand. They're not about coming in the middle of the night, dropping out of a helicopter and killing a bunch of people.
And you raise a good point too. Go ahead.
Sorry, Tom, if I can address a couple things because Linda raised some great points here. First, let me start with the policy shop, because Mike Sheehan, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, has been a fantastic partner in dealing with me and U.S. Special Operations Command. And frankly, having his focus on the key issues that I've had to deal with has been invaluable to me. It's not only a professional relationship, it's a great personal relationship. But I would agree with you, Linda, it has been, we have not grown that shop to the appropriate level where it needs to be able to handle a number of the issues that are starting to come up. The other piece on the working of the talent management, if you will, and having control over our personnel. Again, the report is exactly right. I don't control the promotions for our Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps officers. The good news is I've got a great dialogue with the service chiefs, and it does get back, we talked about the trust factor earlier. I will tell you, with all of the service chiefs, and some of them like Ray Odierno, who I've spent more time with than my wife over here in the last 12 years, We've got a great relationship. He has been very supportive of special operations, as has the Commandant and the CNO and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So these are great relationships that, again, allow me some maneuver space in bringing the soft issues forward. So as we look at how we're going to promote guys and how we're going to build the capability of our enlisted and NCO ranks, we are working kind of shoulder to shoulder with them. But one other thing I want to address, Tom, before you move on here is I want to make sure I set the record straight on Capitol Hill, because frankly we get fabulous support from Capitol Hill. There are elements of it that kind of question some of the things we do, and I'm okay with that. I mean, that is absolutely their responsibility, and they need to do that. And if I can't appropriately articulate what we're trying to do, then maybe it's not the right thing to do. I mean, I trust their experience, and I trust them as lawmakers. But I will tell you, from particularly the two committees, the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee that deal with us directly, we have had incredible support, as well as with the HAC-D and the SAC-D. So there are always going to be elements in any organization that that don't fully support us. And again, I think that's okay. So I have an obligation, my staff has an obligation to engage with them early and often and keep them abreast of what we're doing and answer their questions. And again, I'm happy to do that. But we get great support from Capitol Hill.
Would you like to control promotions?
No, I mean, I'm comfortable with where we are. I mean, we've had, our promotion rates are higher than the average rate for the services. I'm not sure at this point in time, I don't disagree with Linda. I want to make sure that's clear. I don't disagree with her finding. I'm not sure I'm prepared to do that right now because as Linda well knows, it would require another investment, large investment in staff to be able to manage and promote all of our officers and enlisted within the special operations community. So right now I don't have the capability to do that, and partnering with the services as it stands right now is probably a better approach to take. Maybe in the future, if that opportunity presents itself, we'll relook that.
And Congresswoman, do you want to address that issue too? Would you recommend any changes here in Special Operations Command that
I really wouldn't. I've learned up close and personal how hard it is to change structures. I had a role in creating the Department of Homeland Security also. And no, I think having a good leader with demonstrated results, build trust relationships with other people without upsetting rice bowls is a better way to go. I just wanted to make one other point, though, on this building partner capacity piece, which seems to me a very good forward plan. Adam Smith, Congressman Adam Smith from Washington State, who is the ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, came here a couple weeks ago talking about this. He's been around the world with special operations folks observing what we do, and his point was that building partner capacity is, and maybe this is what you mean, but it's just not clear enough to me what you mean, was not only about building partner capacity inside our government, having a whole of government approach and featuring smart power over hard power, but building partner capacity with other governments. And he was talking about Africa in particular, and that where we do that, where we build trust with other governments, which I would say is at least a question mark to me about how we're doing in Afghanistan, but where we really build trust with other governments, we have a better chance of succeeding. And I just wanted to ask if that's what
I'll tell you, I will give tremendous kudos to Linda, because she has been raising this issue for many, many years. And frankly, folks within the special operations community listen to Linda Robinson. And when they listen to her, I listen to them and I listen to her. And her focus on why building partner capacity is important, why security force assistance is important, how we have to build up our special forces capability, all the work she has done, I will tell you, is why I'm moving this initiative forward, is because when you listen to what she has to say and the power of her arguments, it's hard to argue it. So Linda, first, thanks for the great work you've done on this.
I want to talk a little bit more about Special Operations Forces in the way ahead, out to 2020. And one of the problems over the past number of years has been, how do you train forces in countries that may be, their leadership or the military may be somewhat unsavory? This has come up over the past. In Indonesia, in Mali, of course, you were prevented by law from training troops here because the government was overthrown. El Salvador is another example where you had a lot of criticism back in the 80s for doing this. Walk me through how you move ahead on this issue. I know you, of course, have civilian masters, and they would help you on this as well as State Department. Talk a little bit about that, and also, the argument could be made that it's good for us to be in a country like Mali or Salvador or Indonesia, because you do build those relationships, those personal relationships. The current leader, the current general running the show, might be an unsavory character, but we get to know who else is in there as well, and it's beneficial not only to that country but the United States as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think what we've found in the military over the years, and certainly folks that have worked in the diplomatic corps recognize the same thing. If you engage with people and build that trust factor up, they're less likely to do nefarious things or act badly. So from our standpoint, if we work with a unit that is a little bit questionable, we can show them what right looks like. We can talk about civilian control of the military. We can talk about good order and discipline. We can talk about human rights. And so this is part of our engagement. We don't just teach them to kind of shoot, move, and communicate, as we talk about in kind of infantry terms. We teach them about what we think are universal values, not Western values, not American values, but universal values. And that is a very important part of our engagement. We do this again in full concert with the country team and the embassy. So, when we propose that we're going to work with a particular Special Forces unit, we will work with the embassy. They will tell us whether or not that's a good unit to work with. Most of the times we have to go through what's called the Leahy vetting if it's a training piece. And again, there has been some, I think, mischaracterization of my position on the Leahy vetting. I'm all about the Leahy law. I mean, the last thing we want to do is to be operating and training with folks that have committed gross human rights violation, which is the letter of the Leahy law. My only issue has been we both in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, and State Department and others, we've got to improve the process, because sometimes the process is a little slow, but it's not about the law. I am perfectly comfortable with the law, and we're working to work through that process. So as we identify a unit we want to work with, we go through the Leahy vetting, and once that is determined to be appropriate, then we move forward and we start kind of basics with kind of crawl, walk, run approach. But those relationships are very, very important, because if the country starts to fall, you have insights into what's happening, and potentially you can affect it.
Right. Dan or Linda, you want to weigh in on that?
I would like to say I think it's very important that people don't misinterpret at least my argument that SOF is a panacea, that it can be used everywhere and cure all problems. But I do think that, and I was out there in El Salvador, and I saw, and it was State and Aid and USIA, Intel, all working out there together in the field. But I think Congress played a very important role also in capping the advisors. At 55, I believe, was the number. So there was a clear, because there were a lot of human rights concerns in that case, some very serious problems, but the U.S. stuck with it over the long term, and you wound up with a partner that was out there in Iraq helping as part of the coalition. Kind of an extraordinary evolution, but it took a long time.
Here was an interesting point about capping the advisors. I've talked to Special Forces guys over the years, retired guys, who said it actually worked in our favor. It was almost under the radar. We had just a small number. We didn't have huge bases like Kandahar or Bagram. Right. We were in there training these guys, and it actually worked out better in the end.
I almost think there's an inverse relationship between the size of our footprint and the size of our effectiveness.
And in many cases, it's more sustainable from a political, from that country's perspective. And I think Colombia is the other case where I've been out there and I've seen it, and it was a decade-long plus where it's worked. But I think that it would be a mistake, and there are a lot of people who are very skeptical about it. If the government is too, or the military too deformed, too severe, you know, I think skepticism is warranted, and careful assessments have to be made by the military, but obviously also the policy makers. And in some cases, and some may argue, well, Afghanistan was that case. I guess I'd rather reserve just judgment on that. And I've also watched the development of the Afghan Special Operations Forces, which has been another one of those under the radar missions that SOF has been carrying out in Afghanistan. I think there's a danger there of becoming almost more ambitious, especially if forces are going to go away. I think but the small footprint approach, meaning partnered small footprint, is really the wave of the future.
And do you have anything to weigh in on this, particularly with training some maybe unsavory characters or countries that some would argue maybe we shouldn't be involved there. Is there a tension between you and the military about the approach there?
Again, I mean, I'm not trying to gloss over differences, but I come from a human rights background and actually did training with security forces in places like Indonesia and elsewhere. And I think that the processes can always be made better. You can always try to expedite them or accelerate them. There's always going to be some differences. But the fact that they exist and we're trying to do exactly that, and that there is a jointness of vision about what we seek to do, I think is exactly where we've been. And I think there's very good agreement. I think I would just caution, I would almost always come to it that engagement within the constraints and within respecting not only the letter of Leahy, but the spirit of Leahy, which I think sometimes gets lost in it. Yeah. But within those constraints, that engagement is always going to pay dividends down the road. And you see it in our IMET training programs and kind of the lost generation that we have in Pakistan from the Pressler Amendment. I mean, and you see it in any sorts of other types of engagement. But that we also have to keep expectations realistic, and that these time horizons are very, very long. And that is sometimes a hard case to make to those who fund us, because if you look at the two best examples, I think, being Colombia and Indonesia, and this was a decade or more long process, and if you're trying to build capacity or rule of law institutions, it's not going to happen overnight. And so I do think that that a smaller footprint approach where you can start that process and stay engaged over a long time expanse is your greatest source of success.
Maybe a smaller footprint in Afghanistan would have made more sense than what we see now?
I think so. I've thought that for a long time. I always thought that the coin strategy did not fit Afghanistan well. I had some arguments with my very good friend Dave Petraeus about this when he was there. I thought that Afghanistan much more resembled Vietnam than it did Iraq. And intelligent people tried to make the best decisions, and surely the stuff that JSOC did there was impressive, but when it all nets out, what will we leave behind? And it makes a point that's really not about our capability, but their capability. You have to have a willing partner, and I think there is a question mark there about whether our partner in Afghanistan has always been willing to do the things that would lead Afghanistan to become a stable, unified country. And we don't have to go into that now, but I think we've had an uphill battle, and the U.S. has made and our NATO allies, a mighty effort in Afghanistan, and all of those who have been involved should be given our robust thanks, and especially the families of those who lost their lives.
Admiral, any thoughts on that? Would the Salvador model have been a better fit in Afghanistan in hindsight as opposed to what we have? Or as Cale Weston of the State Department said, we should have gone in low and long?
Well, again, I think time will tell. And I'm reluctant to make that assessment at this point in time. I think we're going to need a little while to determine whether or not the strategy that was put in place was successful. But I will tell you, I think it's moving in absolutely the right direction.
Okay, we're out of time. Sorry, thanks. Terrific questions. Thank the panel. Admiral McRaven, Congressman Harman, Linda, and Dan. Thanks so much. And Admiral, don't be a stranger.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.